is so great to be here tonight. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see so many friendly faces in the audience, even if I can only see half of your faces. As Jenny mentioned, I was the director of the Biological Foundation for several years, and I had the privilege to get to plan a lot of these Zahner Lectures, but this is the first one I've ever been able to give, or I've ever given, so I'm glad to be here. These lectures are one of my favorite traditions within the Highlands community, and they've been going on for like 70 years. It's a great opportunity for all of us to get into a room together and talk about important conservation issues and the natural history of this wonderful area. These lectures are named in honor of two of my conservation heroes, Glenda and Bob Zahner. And so Glenda, tonight, in your honor, we are going to talk about, wake up, interdependence. So when I say interdependence, I mean how all of the species within an ecosystem are reliant upon each other. More so than just the species themselves, it's their interactions between one another. So we're going to talk about this and why it's important and what we can do to foster these relationships in our own backyards. So it's not just the plants and the pollinators, though those are very important, but it's also the fungi. I put fungi on there twice because they don't get enough attention and they're really important. Also, how birds interact with insects, which interact with plants, fishes, reptiles, amphibians, all of the things within the ecosystem. They're all dependent upon one another, including us. We are dependent upon all of these species and their interactions for things like clean water and clean air. So it's critical. But we live here in Highlands, or we get to be here in Highlands, and only for a temporary time. And this, we're very fortunate that we have a really healthy ecosystem here. But it's up to us to keep it that way. Highlands is a biodiversity hotspot. You've probably heard this before. That means that we have a great abundance of species of plants and all of those things that I just talked about. This is an important bird area, which is designated by the National Audubon Society, which means we have more species of birds here than most other places in the continental United States. So more species means we have more stability and productivity in our ecosystem, and this is important. There's a lot of reasons why Highlands is a biodiversity hotspot, and this is actually could be a whole nother lecture, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but I want us to be all on the same page. One of the important reasons why we are a biodiversity hotspot is because Highlands is located in the Appalachian Mountains, which are some of the oldest mountains on Earth. So geologists believe that they're somewhere between 450 and 500 million years old. And that's a very long time for speciation to occur, for species to diversify. Another really important thing is the orientation of the Appalachian Mountains. As you know, they run north-south. And so during the last ice ages that we've had, the last one being around 22,000 years ago, a lot of the glaciers receded all the way down to the Allegheny Mountains, which pushed a lot of northern species down into the Highlands area. And when the climate warmed back up again, a lot of those species found niches within our high elevation areas. So this is where we have northern species and southern species that collide, giving us great biodiversity. Another important factor is that we are a rainforest. So on average, we get about 81 inches of rain per year. That's almost 7 feet of rain. That's a lot of rain. And the important thing about our rain is not that the sheer volume of it. Last year we got over 100 inches, and this year we may do the same thing. But it's the fact that we do not have a dry season. Lots of places like the Pacific Northwest get a lot of rain too, but they have a dry period for a certain time during the year. And many of the species that we have here, like salamanders, are dependent upon that constant moisture for their survival. So that's an important factor too, and influences our species that we have here. But we are not going to talk about that all night long. We are going to talk about gardening. So my favorite thing to do is garden. I am a gardener. I have been a gardener since I was about 4 years old, Mom. Yeah, I had my first garden when I was about 4 years old, and I've been doing it ever since. I love gardening. I garden for food. This is my zucchini I grew. I grew some really big zucchinis and cucumbers. Might pass these out later. I love to garden for food. I love to garden for beauty. I love to bring flowers into my house and arrange them and just have them all around me. I love to look out on the landscape and see the flowers out there. But there are other things that I garden for too. I garden for exercise. I garden because it makes me feel tranquil. It's my favorite thing to do on a Sunday afternoon because there's a lot of studies that say that gardening's good for you. And they all say the same thing. They say it's good for you. It brings down your stress levels. And in a world where we're all going through a pandemic and a climate crisis, I think we can all use a little more peace in our lives. Raise your hand if you're a gardener. Or if you just like to sit on your back porch and watch the natural world, right? Lots of you. Yay, yay. It's wonderful. But recently I've been gardening for more than just those things I mentioned. I've been gardening for birdsong. I've been gardening for the chickadees that I see nesting in my backyard. I even garden for bats. It's my new favorite thing. Canty and I will sit on the front porch first thing in the morning and watch the bats swoop in as they catch insects on the fly. It's amazing. So I'm gardening for them as well. I garden for the boomers. Those little, you know what I'm talking about? Those little squirrels, they're so chattery. I love them. And there's 100 more reasons why you might want to garden. But what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about 5 things that you can do in your own garden to nurture life there and those species interactions that make the ecosystem stronger. That, by the way, is my daughter Claire when she was probably about 5 or 6, showing us how fun gardening is. Now, many of you may be familiar with the work of Richard Louv. He is an author, and years ago he came out with a book called Last Child in the Woods. And it really brought our attention to the importance of having nature in your life. And he followed that book with this one, Vitamin N. N is for nature, and how vitamin N is really important for our health and our well-being. So if you're familiar with his work, great. If you haven't, pick up his book. I think you'll find it really interesting. And this is one of the reasons why I garden. Let's see if it'll play. This is happening in our garden right now, right as we're standing here. This is what my front garden looks like, with just hundreds and hundreds of butterflies all over that plant. And you can see the butterflies, but there's bees out there too. They're just everywhere. And this is what I really love. It's not just the flowers. It's those butterflies that are like movable flowers that flutter around. Just beautiful. So that brings me to the very first thing that I would like to consider. The removal of non-native invasive plants. So we are all probably familiar with some of the ones I'm talking about here. We're talking about Japanese knotweed. This one's been sprayed, can you tell? We're talking about oriental bittersweet. Things like the burning bush. There's a lot of plants that are non-native to our environment that we've brought here. We've planted them in our gardens, and some of them are okay. I'm not after every single one of them. I'm not telling you you need to go out there and dig up every plant that is not native to the Highlands Plateau. But some of them are more problematic than others, and the non-native invasives create a huge problem. And let me tell you why. These plants did not evolve here in this landscape. And that gives them a huge advantage because they did not come with their predators. So they have a big competitive advantage over the plants that are from here that get eaten on a regular basis by predators within our ecosystem. Secondly, they tend to, because of the lack of competition, they tend to spread really, really fast. And they're not recognized as food by our native insects. So they're just growing and growing and growing, smothering out our native plants and continuing to grow unchecked. So it's up to us to get out there and remove them. Now, I'm a little guilty of this too. I have English ivy in my garden. I didn't plant it, but it's there, and it's been growing for a few years now. And after kind of talking about it, I was like, I gotta practice what I preach here. This is ridiculous. So I got out there one day and I removed that ivy. Not all of it. You can still see there's some growing up that tree. But I'm on it now. months ago, and I created a vacuum, right? Like, so there's a big open space, and I didn't immediately go back in with new plants to put there. You can do that. If you've got the energy after pulling all that ivy, you can go out there and root plants. Or you can let the native seed bank that's there start to grow. And by now, it's completely vegetated. So I haven't created an erosion problem or anything. The plants were already there. They just couldn't breathe because they were being smothered by all of that ivy. Now here on the Highlands Plateau, we have this really cool organization. You all know about SNPM? Raise your hand if you're a part of SNPM. Dolly, all right. So it is the Coalition for Non-Native Invasive Plant Management. And this is a group of local volunteers that get together and educate our community about the dangers of non-native invasive plants. And they have a program coming up next week. So I want to give them a little props here. It's called Porpoise Circus, and they're specifically looking at oaks. It's given by Dr. Paul Manos, who works with the biological station and is a great instructor. So I hope you'll attend that one and learn more about the Porpoise Circus and what makes oaks the quintessential landscape tree. So this brings us to number 2. Shrink your lawn. Americans have a very, very strange relationship with their lawns. They represent something to us that goes way beyond like the single green hill species that they are. To us, it represents prosperity. It represents that you are taking good care of your property. It has a lot of messages associated with it that go far beyond this monoculture that really does nothing to feed the local ecosystem. We put tons of fertilizer on it, which then washes off into our waterways, and that's why every major river in the United States has a dead zone where the water meets the sea, because we have put so many fertilizers into our waterways. We use insecticides and herbicides, which kills off our native insects. We use a lot of fossil fuels as you're riding around there, pushing your lawnmower, doing your thing. And it's a huge waste of time in a lot of ways. So I want you all to consider just maybe shrinking it down a little bit. Are you all familiar with Doug Talman? I'm going to talk about him a little bit later. But Doug says if half of our lawns were replaced with native plants, we create a new national park that would be 20 million acres, 9 times bigger than Yellowstone and 100 times bigger than Shenandoah National Park. Think about that. A whole new national park. And it will be right at your back door. How great is that? You don't even have to drive to get there. You just walk out your door. Now, as a designer, I understand that lawns play a very important role in our garden design, right? They create negative space, they serve as a foil for our beds. I'm not saying you gotta get rid of it altogether, though if you do that, that'd be okay. But shrink it down a little bit. Plant more beds, create more space for those native plants. Use your grass as pathways. Turf is actually really great to walk on. And we don't like to tiptoe through our garden beds. So create spaces where you can walk through your garden and use the turf there. That's a perfectly good use of that species. Or, here's another idea, have a country lawn. Instead of having a monoculture that you try so very hard to get all of those weeds out of, let the weeds grow. You'll still have a green mat there out in your garden, but let it bloom. Let it have an opportunity to grow. This is what our lawn, which we have a big lawn at our place too, but that's what it looked like when we just let it grow. You see all that salvia lyrata in there? It was just beautiful. Another thing to consider is to be mow aware. Wait a little while before you start mowing your grass in the spring. Just give it an extra 2 weeks if you can, give it longer than that. And that gives the early pollinators an opportunity to wake up and utilize that space by gathering nectar, gathering pollen, before you start whacking it down with your lawnmower. It saves time for you, and it's great for the pollinators. That's what happened when we did No-Mow Day. We stuck with May, and then we moved it into June, and then July, and then August, and that's Claire and my little niece Arden, who just had a wonderful time. We cut paths through it and made like little labyrinths, and they just had the best time running through there. It was a delight. That was last year during the pandemic when all the rules were off. Now this is another, I think, opportunity, really. This is over at the Peggy Crosby Center, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but this is a garden that was installed and kept in wonderful shape by my wonderful husband, who's back there. But what they had here was a steep slope, and it was grass, and they would go in there and they would mow it, and they would weed it, and it was getting eroded, and it looked terrible. It was right at the front of their building. So they had the idea, well, what if we were to plant things and turn it into a flower garden? So that's what they did. But there's this notion that these gardens like this can be unsightly. Have you heard that? Has anybody heard that? So the board was a little nervous about it, so they put this sign here that said, "Flower garden in progress." And it was just a little cue to people to say, we're working on this. We know it's not perfect yet, but we're getting there. We're working on it. And it was a great solution to an ugly, steep slope that was not productive for anything. Now, number 3 is really important. We need to start thinking about insects as essential to our gardens. Now, a lot of us, we have a war with insects, right? We don't like insects. And it's not without good reason. You get stung by a bee, that's a very negative association. You start to be fearful of insects that are flying around and could potentially sting you or hurt you. But it's not fair to lump all insects into the same bucket. They are not all going to sting you. They are not all after you. And some of them, most of them, are essential. They're the little things that run the earth, as E.O. Wilson calls them. And they're an important part of our ecosystem. Here are some of the ecosystem services provided by insects. They pollinate our flowering plants. Without them, our flowering plants would not continue to exist. They convert the energy from plants, plants get energy from the sun. Insects get their energy from plants, and they turn that into protein. It's the first step in the food web. They break down organic matter. Without a lot of insects, we would be neck deep in organic matter, dead leaves and old leaves. And they get eaten. That's really important too. Without them, our whole ecosystem would collapse. So we really need to think of them as important parts of our ecosystem. This is Doug Talmay. I did not set out to be an insect advocate. I'm a plant person. I already mentioned I'm a gardener from way back. But the more I read about Talmay's work, the more I understand the importance of insects in our world, in our gardens, in our lives. He wrote a really great book called Bringing Nature Home. Are you all familiar with that? Some of you are nodding your heads. It's a great book. I gotta say, this one, Nature's Best Hope, fabulous. Makes all of this information so accessible. If you can, pick it up. I mentioned that I didn't start out to be an insect advocate, and that is partially because I grew up in South Florida in the tropics. And I don't know if you've ever been down there, but the tropics offer a whole host of nightmare-inducing insects. They are scary. But the truth is, right now you've seen this before maybe, the insect apocalypse. Apparently, we've had a 45% decline in insect populations globally since 1974. Think about that. Just in that brief amount of time, 45% decline. That's a really scary feature with a group of species that are so important to our ecosystem. So this is where I grew up, South Florida. That's what it looks like. This is my house right here that I grew up in. And most of the yards in South Florida nowadays look like this. Very closely cropped lawns and shrubs that really don't bear any resemblance to what they should look like, maybe. Lots of non-native species there. Not a lot of room for insects. And then if you consider, as I mentioned, those scary bugs, lots of people are going to hire an exterminator to keep their house and in their grounds clear of insects. So if we have a conservative estimate to say, these houses hired the exterminator to get rid of all of the insects on their property, that's probably pretty conservative. It probably looks a lot more like this, right? And then you start to have an entire area that is insect-free zone. Because the insecticides that they use are not discriminatory. They will kill all of the insects that they hit. So if you're targeting mosquitoes, a really bad way to do that is to broadcast insecticide all throughout the neighborhood. Can I remind you about those ecosystem services? Where are those ecosystem services happening in an environment like South Florida? Where does it happen? The answer is probably somewhere else. So the plants, are they getting pollinated? Maybe. There's probably a few floating around. They're not converting as much energy into protein. They're not breaking down the organic matter, and they're, most importantly, not getting eaten. It might be an ecosystem on the verge of collapse. Again, 45% global decline. That's a pretty scary feature. But there's hope. So, have y'all heard about monarchs? Monarch butterflies? They're such a wonderful ambassador for the insect world. People love monarchs. They're like floating flowers. And the caterpillars are pretty cool too. This is a picture that my brother took. And he lives down in South Florida. And so now he's growing milkweed so that he can grow caterpillars. And it's really turned on his nurturing nature. He's growing caterpillars, he's putting it on social media, he's so excited about it. And now he started growing other plants to grow caterpillars. And he is turning his little garden into a caterpillar farm. Because monarchs are great, right? They're beautiful. That's one of their chrysalis. This is here. These are all taken locally, as a matter of fact, because we have monarchs here too. And monarchs are pretty cool. They have this really unique host-plant relationship with Asclepias. It's a group of plants, all in the same genus. And this plant produces secondary metabolites. That's something that the plant doesn't really need for their own growth, but they do it so that they don't get eaten. And these are cardiac, so they basically give you a heart attack. You want to eat a bunch of Asclepias, don't do that. But then they also have another feature where they have the milk, or the sap of milkweed is almost like a latex. So when insects try and bite it, they get their mouth parts all gummed up. But over the course of evolutionary time, monarchs have they have evolved to compartmentalize those toxins within their body. So not only does it not poison them, but it gives them protection throughout their lives because it makes them toxic to birds. And they announce this toxicity through their coloration. That bright colors tells birds, steer clear. I am not going to taste good. And so that's it. And then they also do something. They have a behavior. So not only do they have this ability to metabolize this stuff, but they also have an interesting behavior where they'll go to a branch of the Asclepias and cut the vascular system so that the sap is no longer flowing, so that they can go out and eat all the leaves without gumming up their mouth parts. So just so you know, if you're ever curious and you plant Asclepias or milkweeds in your yard and you're wondering if you have any caterpillars on them, look for a flagging branch because the branch will start to turn yellow when you know you've got caterpillars out there. Such a neat relationship, and a lot of people have started to get into growing caterpillars. And you know why we want to grow caterpillars? Well, it turns out that caterpillars are the perfect little insect. They're pretty non-threatening. There are many, many types of caterpillars. We've got 14,000 different types of caterpillars that we have here in North America. They're easy for birds to find. They can just go out there and look and pick them up. They're easy to eat and to digest. And the birds will pick them up and they'll take them back to their nest and they shove them down the throat of their little babies. They're not very gentle about it. Birds can eat a lot of different insects. They can eat beetles, for example. But beetles have sharp edges to them and a hard kind of shell. And it's not easily digestible, and it can hurt the baby birds as they're shoving them down their throats. So they love caterpillars because they're also very, very nutritious. And as it turns out, caterpillars are the choice food for nesting birds. And they need a lot of them. If you want to have birds in your yard, you need to start growing caterpillars. Because most birds are exclusively insectivores during the breeding season. And studies have been conducted to see how many caterpillars do we really need. And apparently a nesting pair of chickadees needs somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to get their little fledgling or their baby birds to fledge. And that's in a short period of time. So they need to have a lot of caterpillars at their disposal. Birds love caterpillars. They need them. It's essential. We say, oh, that's a photo by Greg Sparks. And again, they're beautiful, right? Remember this? Oh, it's so pretty. Just makes me feel peaceful. There's tons of wonderful butterflies that we have in our area, and that's a very good sign that we are feeding our birds with those caterpillars. Here's some of the common butterflies that we have in North Carolina. Look at that color variation. It's just worth it to just put those on your property. Here's another interesting relationship. Do you guys know about pipeline and butterflies? So a couple years ago, we used to have this native plant sale that we would, it was an auction. And we would often have a pipeline as part of the auction. And when I was trying to get people to buy it, I told them about what happens with pipeline. So you put pipeline in your yard, and it's a great vine. It grows in the shade, it's really pretty, it has neat bloom on it. But the fun thing about pipeline is that during the course of the year, the pipeline swallowtails, which use this plant as their host plant, and only this plant, will go and they'll lay their eggs on it, and the caterpillars start to munch, and they will eat that thing completely down to the ground. And it is so fun to watch because the caterpillars are beautiful, and you know that you are part of the ecosystem. This is another plant that has toxicity to it. It has a renal toxin in it. So if you were to make a big salad out of pipeline leaves, you would have kidney failure, and that would not be a good thing. But it gives the pipeline swallowtails protection for life because they also announce their toxicity through their appearance. But it not only gives the pipeline swallowtails protection, it also gives one of the black dwarf of the eastern tiger swallowtail protection too. Because they have evolved to look like the pipeline swallowtail so that they won't get eaten. It's an example of Mullerian mimicry, and it works very, very well for them. Let's not forget about moths. Moths make caterpillars too. And we have some really beautiful moths here. Does anybody know what that one is? Moth, of course. Moths are mostly active at night, so we don't see them as often. But they can be killed or distracted by light pollution. So keep that in mind. If you have a light that you're leaving on all night long, what it does is it draws the moths in like a moth to the flame, right? And in the morning, when the sun comes out, they're all still stuck there to your wall. And it makes it very easy pickings for birds. You just go and pick them right off. So turn off those lights, let the moths go hide in them before the sun comes up. But it's a great source of caterpillars. The other thing that's important about moths is this particular moth, which is really cute, one of my favorites, looks, when it's in its chrysalis stage, when it's pupating, it looks just like a dead leaf. So if you are eliminating all of the leaves from your property, you're losing all your litter moths. Leave the leaves. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Another species of insects that have gotten a lot of attention, a group of species that have gotten a lot of attention right now are bees, right? We all hear, save the bees. We've got Bee City. Well, honeybees are not a native species. I think you probably knew that by now. But we have a whole host of native bees here in North America. There's really more like closer to 4,000 species, but I don't like to exaggerate, so I put 3,500. Most of them are solitary, so they're not going to try and sting you because they don't have anything to defend. Most don't make honey. The only exception to the honeybee making honey would be bumblebees, and they make a very, very little bit, and it's not enough for us to harvest, so don't worry about the honey. But they're excellent pollinators. Turns out they are the best pollinators out there. Bumblebees are interesting too. We have about 26 different species of bumblebees in North Carolina, and that's important because, as I mentioned, the species interactions, if we lose one species of bumblebee, we've got 25 others, which are mostly generalists, to come in and help us pollinate. So we want that elasticity, that resiliency in our ecosystem. They use a special thing called buzz pollination, and this is important because there's a lot of species of plants that won't release their pollen unless a bumblebee goes and vibrates that flower just at the right frequency to release the pollen. So we want to keep our bumblebees. And then you may have heard about the rusty-patched bumblebee, which is the first insect to be placed on the endangered species list. So that's unfortunate, but something to keep an eye on. The other thing about bumblebees is they tolerate cooler temperatures, so they're really important here on the plateau. Like yesterday when the temperature didn't get up to 60 degrees, yeah, they're the ones who are out there actively pollinating during those cool temperatures that we have so often. These are not bees. Look at how mean they look. Don't they look like nasty characters? Those are not bees, those are wasps, and they will sting you. And the difference between bees and wasps is an important distinction to make. Bees eat pollen and they sip nectar. They have a lot of hairs all over their body, which makes them great pollinators because they collect the pollen on their bodies, and then when they visit from flower to flower, they transfer that pollen. And they're mostly solitary, as I mentioned, and great pollinators. Wasps, on the other hand, they will eat some pollen, but they're mostly meat eaters. So they're mostly trying to get other insects as their primary food source. And they're not very great pollinators because they don't have those hairs. You can see on this one, they're shiny bodies. They have those thin waists. Most are social, which means that they have big nests and they have something to defend. So they will sting you. So be careful with those guys. But only the females sting. Did you know that? The stinger is a modified ovipositor. So only the females sting. The good news is only the females sting. The bad news is there's a lot more females than males. So some of the threats that our pollinators face are, of course, habitat loss. Pathogens, we've introduced a lot of pathogens to our environment, and they particularly are harmful to our bumblebees, which why a lot of them are threatened or just facing extinction. Climate change, climate crisis is a big problem for all of our pollinators. Our ethics, the way we use our landscape, is an issue for them, and of course, insecticide uses. As I mentioned, insecticides do not discriminate between bees and cockroaches. And that brings me to number 4, create better habitat. How do we do this? How do we bring more species into our garden? I'm not a big one for hashtags, but the hashtag beauty is no longer enough. Maybe you've heard that one. And that is to say that it's great to have a beautiful garden, but now as we're facing climate change, as we have ecosystems that have been decimated, it's important for us to think about the other species that we're sharing our gardens with. So it's no longer enough to just plant for beauty. Let's talk about keystone species for a moment, because not all species in your garden are created equal. Some of them have more power than others. A keystone species is a species upon which other species of the ecosystem depend. And if they were removed, the ecosystem would be drastically changed. So right now I want to address a few of these keystone species so that you can think about putting them in your garden. The first one is the microbe. Now these species counts, you're going to see these on here, and these are actually just counting moths and butterfly species. So it's just looking at caterpillars. The caterpillars are important, right? We already talked about that, so that's important. But it's not looking at other insects like the spiders and the beetles and the weevils and the hymenopteros and the hymenopteros. It doesn't count all of those. It's just looking at butterfly and moth species. So let that. Everybody okay? What are you baseball? The next three species we're going to talk about is black cherry. Black cherry supports 362 species of moths and butterflies. It's a really good one to have in your garden. We have them here, they're very common. We often think of them as sort of weedy species, but maybe this will change our mind, that they have a really important role to play. Willows are also really important. They are Lepidoptera magnets. They love to eat those leaves. So they support 456 different species of moths and butterflies with their leaves alone. Goldenrod. So goldenrod gets a little bit of a bad reputation. Goldenrod can be a little bit of a thug in the garden. Kind of, you plant it starts taking over, creeping into places where it doesn't belong. But it's so important. It supports 102 different species of moths and butterflies. And its sheer number of species of of goldenrod that we have here in the United States, and particularly here in Highlands, should be a clue to us that this is a very important plant in our ecosystem. Now, a couple things that goldenrod does. It is the top-ranked species for caterpillars nationwide. So that's very important. We gotta give it a prize for that alone. Bees love it. So great for bees because it has really good sticky pollen. It's drought resistant. That doesn't seem to be a concern for us here, but in some places we maybe have a home somewhere else. That's important. The seeds of goldenrod provide food for a lot of our overwintering bird species that we have here. Things like tufted titmice and the Carolina chickadee. The intertwining roots, which we mentioned that things are really hard to, it starts creeping and then it's hard to get rid of. That intertwining of the root system is very important for water retention. It helps with erosion and it helps the water sink down into the water table instead of just running straight off. So that's a really important feature too. It is not the cause of your hay fever. I'm sure you've all heard that. Oh, the culprit on that one is actually ragweed. And ragweed is wind pollinated, so the pollen is in the air. As I mentioned, goldenrod has very big, sticky pollen that does not float in the air, it falls to the ground. So it is not responsible for your hay fever. Give it a little credit. Sunflowers support 64 species, and they're beautiful. We have lots of species of sunflowers here on the Highlands Plateau, and they're really wonderful and a little better behaved, I must say. Joe Pye weed. I love Joe Pye weed. Once upon a time, my friend Paul Sanger used to have a Joe Pye weed party where he would have everybody wear hats and come out and celebrate the Joe Pye weed right about this time of year when it was all blooming. Lots of plants have this word weed in them. And as we know, weed is just a plant in the wrong place. But it paints a picture for us when we think about weed. Things like your ironweed, Joe Pye weed. We automatically think, is that really worth putting in my garden? Is it worthy of a prize spot in my garden? And in the case of Joe Pye weed, I say yes. But, as I mentioned, I am a gardener first and foremost. And the truth is if you have Joe Pye weed in your garden, you are going to bring in lots of wonderful other species. But you are also going to be pulling some Joe Pye weed at places where it does not belong. Where's Jade Tracy? Jade, right there. So Jade and I spend a lot of time pulling Joe Pye weed out of the garden because it is a very good seeder and it pops up where it doesn't belong. So I just want to say, from that perspective, I have a suggestion to make. So our native species, Eutropium, Fistulosum, and Maculatum, they're both wonderful. But there are some cultivars that are out there that are a little bit better behaved. I have a Joe Pye weed in my front garden that is about 12 feet tall. That is not a plant that you can easily put in a small garden bed this size, right? So you can take up the whole thing. But my favorite is gateway. Do you all know that one? Glenda knows it. It's beautiful. It has really red twigs. I like the color of the bloom. It's a little bit deeper and darker, and it's very well behaved in your garden. So if you're not comfortable with the idea of the 12-foot tall perennial in your garden, you may want to consider gateway. Or a little Joe. No, I don't like little Joes much. So you may be wondering, where am I getting all this information on species now? I did not do these studies myself. That came out of Doug Talamay's lab up at the University of Delaware, and his graduate students who are on top of this science. I'm so impressed with what they are working on and what they're coming up with. And one of the things they've come up with is the Native Plant Finder, which is a website. It's an excellent website where you can go in and you put your zip code in, and it tells you what the keystone species are for your area. So this is the one for Highlands. We've got goldenrod, strawberry, sunflower, Joe Pye weed, and a whole host of others. It has perennials, shrubs, trees, all kinds of information there. It's a really great resource. And you can do it for any zip code in the United States. So you may be wondering, okay, I'm going to shrink my lawn, I'm going to do that, I want to plant more native plants, but where do my opportunities lie? If you have a little waterway on your property, you might want to consider ditch gardening. Canty and I have been ditch gardening for years. That's what it looks like in the spring, and that's what it looks like now. So many of our native species just love that environment. And really, all we have to do is leave them alone. And they came up, and they bloom, and they create this wonderful habitat for all of the other insects and birds. This is what it looks like in the wintertime. And this is important. You have to be okay with a little bit of messiness in your garden. Because if you're too quick to clean up those old stalks, you're going to be eliminating a lot of your pollinators. Many pollinators will overwinter in the stems of things like joe pine. And so if you go in there and you cut it all down, and you burn it or get rid of it somehow, you've just invited the pollinators in and then led them to doom. So don't do that. Be a little bit of a lazy gardener. There's a time for everything. It can be beautiful. So let that stuff grow. And a lot of people ask me, well, when do I cut it back? Do I cut it back? I don't want this looking like this all year long. And my advice to you is to wait as long as you can before the spring before the leaves start to emerge in the spring. And most of the bee species and a lot of pollinators use the last 12 inches before the ground. So if you cut stuff back to about 12 inches, you can still preserve a lot of your pollinators there. So, and don't run over them with a lawnmower, just chop them down a little bit. Weed eater, chop them with shears, it's good exercise. And then you get that. And then, pocket meadows are another great idea. You can have a relatively small area and have several species in there. Please be mindful to put at least a few of those keystone species in there so you know that you're maximizing your space as much as possible. But you can fit them into the landscape in little ways. And welcome a little bit of that wildness into your landscape. It's okay. That's where the good stuff is. It's in that wild space. This is another example of a little pocket meadow that we have at our property. You can really pack a bunch of stuff in there, and I think it looks beautiful. Urban landscapes are often an opportunity for a pocket meadow here or a pocket meadow there. I think that's in Cashiers, right?
It's right there.
Oh, it's right over
Out the door.
We call this a hell strip because it's just a terrible place for a poor plant to have to make a living. But they can do it. Look at that hyacinth. That's absolutely beautiful. And that's right here in Highlands. So lots of opportunities. And this brings me to my fifth and final point, is to build a coalition of conservation partners. Find your tribe. This is important. And we have a great tribe here on the plateau. We've got the Highlands Biological Station, we've got the Highlands Land Trust, we've got SNPM, we've got Bee City, and the Highlands Plateau Greenway, and they are all pulling in the same direction. So whether you like to build trails, you like to put in gardens, or you like to come and listen to people talk for an hour, you have a tribe out there. Support your local nurseries. Where's Jeff Zahner? He's in here somewhere. Yeah, there he is. Jeff has a wonderful nursery called Shitutu Gardens. Jeff would love to sell you native plants. Am I right, Jeff? He would love it. Ask him for them. Tell him that that is what you're looking for. Tell him you want native phenotypes if at all possible, and we'll build up a demand for them. It's okay to ask them. It's also okay to ask them not to sell non-native invasive species. You don't have to be mean about it, but you can ask them. They probably need to hear that. So now is my favorite part of the presentation when I get to talk about a few of the cool projects that we have in the town of Highlands. The first one I'm going to mention is, of course, the North Campus, because everybody in this room is a part of the Biological Foundation in some way, shape, or form. And this project was funded by 100% by donors from our community. And so congratulations. We've got this great big garden with lots of different species that changes throughout the year. This is a spring picture, this is midsummer, and this one's taken about 2 weeks ago. So it shifts, it changes. It's a great place for inspiration. You can find out more about native plants there. This is the Peggy Crosby Center, that I mentioned earlier. Look at it. It's just beautiful. Created, and it's right next to the school. The students walk by there all the time. As I mentioned, this is a garden that is cared for very lovingly by my better half, Canty Worley, back there. He's done a fabulous job with it. They were skeptical, but it looks great. Another project that we did about a year ago was at the Highlands Plateau Greenway. This is on Oak Street at our new trailhead. And about June of last year, midst of the pandemic, everybody's wearing masks there. We got a group of volunteers together to put in a new pollinator garden. I took this picture yesterday. That's what it looks like just a year. Really took off. You see Kaden up there, Laura? Yeah. She's there. So yes, anybody in here from the Mountain Guard Club? Or the Highlands Historical Society? Maybe a few of you. All right, we got some Historical Society people. So they did a neat project at the old jail last year, where this was really a hellscape. Nothing really grew in there. And so they planted all native species in there, and that's what it looked like yesterday. Beautiful. Great example of use of native plants. You see that Joe Pivey? Sure. That thing's probably 10 feet tall. That's a tall Joe Pivey. Similarly, the Historical Society's got a native plant garden in front of the Prince House. And there's this really wonderful display of native shrubs. See this? This is designed and donated by Jeff Zahner. So way to go, Jeff. Good job. These are all examples of how our community is pitching in to make this a reality, to display native plants, to show that these gardens are beautiful, a part of the ecosystem, and I'm so proud to be a part of a community that values this. So good job. I'm really happy to be here today, and that's all I have for you.
For our reception.
Okay, let me see, up here.
Hey, I really enjoyed the insect count on each of the trees and shrubs, plants. Do you know what, like a non-native, like Japanese maple, what that insect count would be on a Japanese maple?
Yeah, very low. It may be 1 or 2.
Oh,
Yeah. And a lot of people point to, there's some plants, I'm going to use butterfly bush as an example. Because a lot of people plant butterfly bush. And it's not a native species, but the bees are all over it, right? The bees are nectaring from it, but as a host plant, it supports 0 species here. So it is taking up space, and the pollinators are utilizing it for the nectar, but they are not using it at all as a food source.
and it's invasive.
And it's invasive, it really is. I had one that popped up at the North Campus, out of nowhere. I don't know where it came from. It just was a seed, and it's gotten pretty big. Yes, ma'am?
My question is, I heard from a biology major in college, she was saying that if you replace your grass with moss, that moss uses up, takes in more CO2 than grass and also gives out more oxygen. Is that true?
I believe that is true. And moss is also a really great option because of the way that it absorbs rainwater and then releases it back into the soil or into the atmosphere. It also harbors a lot of, under the moss, things like salamanders and lots of arthropods live. So moss is a great option. It's native.
Yeah.
So, yes, sir.
We got a pipeline. We love seeing it eaten every year. Last year, nothing came. So I guess my question is that butterfly disappeared? Is it just
Yeah, that's a concern, obviously.
What was the question?
So he has a pipe vine at his house that is usually decimated by the caterpillars, but last year they didn't see any of them. Now last year was kind of an off year for the pipevine swallowtail caterpillars and for the butterflies themselves. And I noticed this last year too, so that was on my radar. Because I kept waiting for them to show up, and they were slow. I think it was a combination of the amount of rain that we had at the wrong time of year, and it's also, insects can be sort of cyclical. So it might have just been an off year for that insect, but you're not the only one who noticed that and mentioned it. So I think that's what was happening. Are you seeing them this year?
hope they come back here? Still, it's a healthy plant.
Yeah.
It's waiting for
Good. Keep it there. They'll be back. Yes, Andy.
Tent caterpillars,
Talk about them.
Thank you for mentioning the 10
Not
caterpillars.
so many others this year, but.
Yeah, so far not so many, but people love to hate the 10 caterpillar, right? They look at them and they're like, oh, they're so ugly. But think about this. Those 10 caterpillars ripen, if you will, just at the time when migrating birds are coming through our area. And those migratory birds need that protein because they stop here and they refuel for a very long journey. And they need all of the fats and protein in those 10 caterpillars in order to make that journey. So if you can think of them as important bird food and not an eyesore on your trees, then maybe that will help you to live with it. Is that what you wanted to hear, Andy? They are. They are. Yep. Not only are they needed, but they're really, really important for our ecosystem, for our birds.
So I have bee-balm that's trying to take over a whole section of my garden. And I see hummingbirds going on, but is there really anything that the hummingbirds can get out of it?
Yes. Nectar. Oh, if you were to snack one of those flowers, your hand would come out wet. They have so much nectar in them, and those hummingbirds need it's way better than a hummingbird.
Because right now, it looks like the bee-balm is almost dried up and the hummingbirds are still yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's likely that there is maybe still some nectar there. If not, then they'll move on. But it's so much better to plant bee balm to feed your hummingbirds than to put one of those feeders out. Those are bee balm is a hummingbird feeder.
Okay, one more? Yeah, one more good question, anybody?
All of them.
How are the bats doing?
That's a great question, and I'm really I don't know the answer to that per se, but we've got Dr. Rhoda Patrick, who is going to be our new IE instructor, and she is actively doing research on the bats. And so what she is doing, I think I can talk about it very quickly. She has picked 30 sites in Thailand. Each site has to have a water source on site, and she is surveying the insects that she finds there, both aquatic insects that are emerging from the surface of the lake, as well as insects that are coming to her black light that she has. She's collecting that data for a 4-hour period. She does it every half an hour. I'm telling you this because I know you want to know. And she's also picking up on that fly over event, so the sounds that they're making. So she's got a detector that is like registering every time there's a bat. And she's going to give a presentation on
September 2nd.
September 2nd. So that's a really great example of some active science that is happening in our community in the research that is going to emerge from it. I think it's going to give us a lot more information about that, so come back.
Well, thank you. So next week